In this lesson, we learn about image-based lighting, exterior lighting, and the scene environment section of the Corona render settings. When we talk about image-based lighting or IBL, we mean instead of using traditional lights, we use a 360 degrees image that has a very dynamic range, usually in EXR or HDR format, and define that image as our environment map. And this way, the render engine uses the color and intensity values of that specific image to illuminate the scene. And if done right, it can provide very realistic lighting. You can use this method to light an interior shot or an exterior one, and you can find tons of free and commercial HDRIs online. For the first part of this tutorial, we want to use an HDRI image to light the current scene. We have some books and this clock and this bottle, so let's see how we can go about it. The first thing to do would be to load your desired HDRI image into a Corona light material. So let's create a new Corona light material. Open it up. We need to load our HDRI image as an emission texture. Here I have this hotel room 4K HDRI, which is a free HDRI from hdrihaven.com, which is spelled hdrihaven.com. Let's load it here. And if I go inside the bitmap and open up a big preview window, you can see the HDRI image we'll be working with. The next step would be to create a Cinema 4D sky and apply the Corona light material to the sky. Just a simple Cinema 4D sky, not a Corona sky. And just to increase the preview quality of the map, let's go to the preview tab of the Corona light material and increase the preview size to 2048. Now we can start the interactive rendering and rotate the sky until we get a nice lighting. And as we rotate it, you notice we can get different lightings by simply rotating one HDRI image. In this case, let's set the rotation age to around 154 degrees. As you can see from the render, the HDRI image is responsible for the lighting in the scene. We can set the exposure to around -0.5 and increase the highlight compression to about 1.5 to kind of avoid those burnout areas in the render. So as you can see, by simply plugging an HDRI image to our environment, we get a very beautiful and realistic lighting. There is another way of setting an HDRI image in Corona as your environment. For now, let's hide the sky, and if you open up the render settings window and go to the scene environment tab, we can actually override Cinema 4D environment and set the Corona light material containing our HDRI as our environment here. So let's enable override Cinema 4D environment option and drag the Corona light material here. And now we can use these offset and scale parameters to control the exact placement of our HDRI. So if I increase the offset U probably to around 43%, we get the exact same lighting and angle as when we were using the Cinema 4D sky. We also have access to different mapping options, including spherical, cubical, and frontal, which, as we will learn later on in the course, can be very useful. Then we have 3 environment overrides for direct visibility, reflections, and refractions. Obviously, you can connect a different HDRI compared to your environment HDRI, and that map will be used in direct visibility, reflections, or refractions. So for example, if I create a new Corona material and this time, Corona light material, sorry, and this time load another free HDRI from hdrlabs.com, which is called ProWash Ref, and connect it to the direct visibility override, and enable it as well. And make sure interactive rendering is running. For this map, let's set the offset hue to 75%. You notice the lighting is coming from the HDRI that we have defined as our environments map, but because of the new HDRI that we defined as our direct visibility override, that map is visible in our render, but it does not affect the lighting whatsoever. You can obviously use the Cinema 4D Sky alongside this kind of visibility override options, so you don't have to necessarily use the override Cinema 4D environment option to be able to use these options as well. You can use the Cinema 4D Sky or the override Cinema 4D environment options with these visibility overrides options. For now, let's disable direct visibility override and override C4D environment so we can unhide the sky for now. And let's close the render settings window and get back to the light material. In case you wanted to increase or decrease the brightness of your HDRI, you can simply increase or decrease the intensity of your Corona light material. But to have a bit more control over your HDRI, I tend to use the Corona Color Correct map, which allows for some linear adjustment of the HDRI's exposure and also color correcting the map. So let's open up the Corona Node Material Editor and drag the Corona light material in. I'll load the Corona Color Correct map. Now connect the HDRI map as the shader input and connect the color correct node as the emission texture of the Corona light material. Now we can use this exposure value to linearly adjust the brightness of the HDRI map, or use this tint color to tint the HDRI image with a specific color, or use this simple brightness, saturation, and contrast values to color correct the map. So we are basically done with the first part of this lesson. For the final render, I would like to have some depth of field. So select the Corona camera tag and enable depth of field in its settings. And set the F number to 4 so we get a very shallow depth of field. I'm gonna change my secondary solver from UHD cache to path tracing because we don't have a difficult lighting and the direct lighting from the HDRI reaches almost everywhere. Set the pass limit to around 32 passes, or around 3% of, probably something like 4% for the noise limit. Would do just fine, but in this case I'm gonna use 32 passes. And the last thing would be to enable denoising and set the output resolution to 1600 by 1600. I think we are ready for the final render, so let's stop the interactive rendering and now we can start the final render. The render is still going on, but I've already done this render before. So what you need to do is to stop the render when the image gets clean. And you have two options actually to stop your render. You can see there is this stop button, and if you click and hold, there is this cancel button as well. When you press the stop button, the denoising, if you have it enabled, will be applied. But if you actually use this cancel option, the denoising won't be applied even if you have it enabled in your render settings. You can obviously set a time limit for like 10 minutes or a pass limit for like 32 passes like what we have done here, and then when the render reaches that pass or time limit, the render will be stopped automatically and denoising will be applied. If you go to the stats tab of the frame buffer down here in the performance section, the number of total passes that has been rendered and the noise level can be seen. Normally 32, or for more complex scenes 64 passes can be considered a good quality render, but ultimately you can decide on when to actually stop the render. Here if I just press stop, the render will be stopped and you can see the denoising will be applied. One good thing about Corona is even if you stop the render before reaching the defined pass, noise or time limits in the render settings, you can simply click and hold on this render button and choose resume last, and the render will resume from where you stopped it. Even if you have reached a pass, noise or time limit and you are still not satisfied with the quality of your render, you can simply increase those in your render setting and then come here and resume the render. Now, I have rendered this scene for 32 passes and saved out a CXR or Corona EXR version of my render to my drive. And if I open up the CXR file, the render will be opened up in Corona Image Editor, which has a very similar interface to Corona Frame Buffer. We can do some quick color correction on it. Obviously, you can do the same thing in Corona Frame Buffer, but for recording purposes, I'm using Image Editor in this case. For now, let's set the white balance to about 6000 to cast out some of that warm tones. Increase the contrast to around 2 and filmic shadows to 0.5. You can enable the curves and make the shadows a bit bluer, just a tad. And now you can save out this image as a JPEG or a PNG or EXR file. Okay. We're done with this first part of the lesson, and in the next part I'll be showing you how to do exterior lighting with what we just learned. For the second part of this lesson, we have this exterior scene. It's a free exterior scene from, I think, 3darkshop.com. The scene has been stripped to its bare minimum, so it has no texture, no foliage, and I've just applied a default Corona material to everything and a glass material to the windows. If I run the interactive rendering, obviously we just get a black render because we have no lights. So let's create a new Corona light material. We have another gorgeous HDRI from hdrihaven.com. It's called The Sky is on Fire. And we're going to be loading it as the emission texture. The only thing we need to do is to assign it to a Cinema 4D Sky. I'm gonna set the preview quality of the map to 2048 and assign it to a Cinema 4D Sky. In the render settings, make sure the secondary GI is set to path tracing, as we are rendering an exterior scene. Even though it's a simple exterior scene, so UHD cache can also be used, but let's stick with the principles and use path tracing and run the interactive rendering. I'm gonna just rotate the sky. You can see, let's try different rotations, maybe 50 degrees, 100 degree, 150, 200. You can experiment with these values, but for now let's try something like 20 degrees. Now let's see what we get. And now you get this beautiful render by simply using that HDRI. For this render, let me cast out some of that cooler tones by setting the white balance to around 7200 and increase the contrast to 2 and filmic shadows to 0.5. And there you have it. The HDRI we are using was taken close to sunset, so the shadows are not very apparent. That's why we don't get, very sharp and obvious shadows. But if for any reason you wanted to get sharp shadows from any HDRIs, you can add a Corona sun and align it to where the sun is located in the HDRI, and then increase the sun intensity so it matches with the lighting from the HDRI, or decrease it. So in this lesson, we learned about image-based lighting, exterior lighting, and the scene environment section of the Corona render settings. See you in the next lesson.